Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Dancing with Damage. I'm Ian, your resident philosopher.
And I'm Abby, your resident author.
And today we talk about episode 37, which is A Whole New World. We are talking about the new communities.
Yes, it may sound a little sci-fi, but we want you to remember that this is likely 100 or 200 or 300 years in the future. I know we say decades, but realistically speaking, this plan could take place over 500 years. Easily. We'd like it to go a little bit faster, but we understand that progress takes time. So just keep in mind, would this be something that would sound like a good idea in the future for different people?
Very good point. The demons on the backs of human progress. Now, before we get into it, Abby, you raise an interesting point. You talk about centuries for this plan to be implemented. And I've spoken with a few people who have a very pessimistic view of the future of humanity, and it colors their view of how we should be acting in this day and age. And I'll give you an example. I was speaking to someone about this theory, and the person said, well, the way humanity's going and climate change is going, the world's going to end soon. And so we don't really need to worry about improving it. Why not just let it all burn and have fun while the fire is raging, kind of thing? Why make any sacrifices at all to try and change anything? And I even think there's some books about that basically advocate for the idea that we're too late and what's the point? But it brings me in mind of a few things. First of all, the cockroach. The mighty cockroach.
La cucaracha.
Indeed, la cucaracha. Because the planet's got quite a few kilometers left on it. If the planet Earth were a car, I think some of the projections for how long the solar system's going to stay intact without the sun imploding or exploding or whatever it is suns do, not a scientist, I think we've got a few billion years on the clock. So we're relatively young in terms of, I think, a planet that can sustain life. And humans, Abby, are quite resilient. And it occurs to me that even if there was some mass event, climate change or war or something major, it occurs to me that humans would survive, some pockets would survive, and like the cockroach, eventually, after a couple hundred years would pass, would repopulate the Earth again. Doesn't it seem that way to you?
Yes. I mean, it would be almost impossible for climate events, however regular and widespread they are, to hit every pocket of the world in a substantial enough way that it wiped out every person living there. We already deal with horrible, tragic events, but usually they happen in a staggered fashion, and usually humans find a way to bounce back. But even if the absolute disaster came to be, there are places that would be relatively livable still on the planet.
That's right. A good example is our chickens. Abby and I have some chickens. Sometimes we look at their feathers and we might see a little red mite. They're little bugs that crawl around in chicken feathers. And so what Abby and I do is we take diatomaceous earth.
Diatomaceous earth, like Mickey Mouse, an M.
I always call it diatomaceous earth, but you can't buy that apparently. Apparently it's diatomaceous earth. And we take it in our hands and we scrub the chickens with it.
Gently.
Gently.
He's being very enthusiastic.
They get tousled. And this kills the mites and the chickens can be happy. But we always have to do it every so often, don't we, Abby? Because even though we treat it as best we can, there's always some that survive, aren't there?
I don't get it, but they do.
That's the way life is. Life is very resilient and humans doubly so. And so when I hear counter-arguments to improving society and improving humanity, like what's the point? It puts me in mind of the cockroach and the chicken mite, but also like a bankrupt person. Let's say a person spends very badly and they become bankrupt. Eventually, that person is going to get money again, and unless the underlying problem of the spending is addressed, won't they just keep becoming bankrupt and suffer more and more and more until the end of their existence?
That reminds me of a problem very pervasive in social media and the news right now. It's that a majority of people reaching retirement age do not have the funds available to afford retiring. And every year, the amount required to retire, or recommended to retire, is increasing. It used to be a couple $100,000, then it was $1 million, and now it far exceeds $1 million because life expectancies are so good and people are retiring in their 50s, 60s, sometimes 70s. But even then, the life expectancy is going to 80, 90. And that's looking at, only having a small amount a year, just having a modest home or a modest rent, eating modest food. No, but seriously,
Tasty.
life is very expensive. And a lot of people are saying nowadays, a lot of young people are saying, well, there's no point saving for retirement because the world's not going to exist. So I'm just going to party now that I'm 20. But here's the thing. What if the world doesn't end? What if you keep living? What if you're one of the people, even if natural disasters occur, that manages to survive? What's your plan then? If you've not prepared for the world to perpetuate, then what are you going to do? And also, we do still have a chance. I know that climate change is sort of on a warpath, but there is possibility still to mitigate it to some extent, to hopefully decrease the damage that will be done. And if we give up now, we're basically saying, hey, we want people to perish who might not need to perish. We want our children to grow up in a world where they have no future. We want to guarantee that we made children just so they will suffer and perish before they even get a chance to live. And that is deplorable. It disgusts me. I can't handle that.
She can't handle it. So either the modern human civilization is going to keep limping along and hopefully eventually heal itself through hopefully an understanding of damage and proactive social policy, either following the social blueprint or whatever other plan, but there needs to be a real plan that is based in logic as opposed to the current absence of a plan generally in society. Or society is going to collapse and restart. But again, in the restarting, it's important to learn from the mistakes of the past and to eventually improve. So either way, even though this plan is a long plan, it is important, if it is the plan that becomes prevalent, it may not be, but if it is, it's important to try it. Because by doing nothing, we ensure a cycle of suffering and damage. And really, it's a shame because when I think of I think we talked about this maybe on the show, maybe I talked about it with someone else. But in all the galaxies and all the universe, there are so few planets that are capable of sustaining life.
It's such a small margin, yeah.
It's really a winning of the lottery times a lot. So it's such a shame for us humans to squander that opportunity that's been given by living in a suffering and causing the ecosystem to suffer existence. It reminds me of if you're in a desert and a traveler finds an oasis. In the whole wide desert, there is one spring and trees and greenery there. And instead of making the most of it, the traveler poisons the oasis so it can't be drank out of, cuts down all the trees, and turns it into a deplorable place. It's just very unethical thing to do. It's an ungrateful thing to do. And it's a shame. It's a waste of life, which is so rare. So instead of that, we want the plans to be followed, hopefully, for the betterment of our civilization, hopefully. And I think it could be because of the rat in the corner that we talked about, that this is the moment of change as the generation is ready to fight back against damage and against unmoderated technology, et cetera, et cetera. I think this is a civilization that can save itself, even though it is gloomy, certainly, and there are storm clouds over us and on the horizon too. So let's talk about the new communities. Yes, we might be 100 years or more in the future. But Abby, we talked about re-ruralization in a previous episode. Now you, an author, a wordsmith, a painter of language.
You can't say that when I don't have hours at a computer to perfect my sentences.
Yes, an artiste. Chapter 46.
Yes.
I think it's called The Soup and the Salt. And it's a story about how if you have soup, if you put too much salt in it, it becomes
inedible.
Very gross. But if you don't put enough in, it's kind of blah. And so it talks about the population of new communities that we recommend to best articulate the values of the new communities, namely being self-sustaining and not putting pressure on the ecosystem around the new communities, having a good and sufficient gene pool for the little new communityers, and also so that the wings of love are empowered so that people know each other, proximity, and rely on each other codependence to make sure there's that injection of love into that society. So tell us about these new communities.
So we are not scientists. We are not experts in many things. So we give a general recommendation based on our sci-fi, fantastical, utopic, futuristic world. So take this with a grain of salt, and obviously it can be modified. But maybe a new community to start out would be a few hundred to a couple thousand people, and maybe as it becomes more robust in the smaller thousands of people, maybe like 10,000 people would be a great number for a community, because you can have many small communities that are sort of self-sustaining, and presumably based on human nature. There might be people who want to go to a different community to try to find the love of their life, or maybe there's a specific job they really want and there's an opening in a different community. So I feel like that's a good number. I grew up in a town that was literally, when I was 10, 1,000 people. I think now it's 5,000 or 6,000 people, and it still feels like a pretty big town. And it's nice because pretty much everybody. So there's sort of a feeling of safety, and those wings of love are in a way enacted because you're less likely to steal or commit crime or harm people who you know. Even knowing someone's name is a very powerful tool to make you feel like you have an alliance with them. So I do like that about that sort of smaller community size, so it's not too outrageous, sort of reins it in. And also, when you have a smaller community, there is that sense of community, for lack of a better word, that people tend to hold on to, where I think in newer communities, there would be more ours as opposed to mine. Because as we said earlier on, it would be beneficial for everybody if housing was more of a public right as opposed to something we had to individually own and earn. Because if everyone has a house that they're just allowed to live in forever, and they don't have to worry and put a financial strain on themselves, think of all the financial freedom they will have and the other good they can do. So I think, especially with food centers that provide people with nourishment, all of the major things would be sort of shared amongst the people. Think of, there's mom groups already on Facebook and in neighborhoods where people have babies. And instead of throwing things out, and because babies grow so quickly, all the moms sort of talk to each other and they say, okay, I'm gonna have a baby next month. And then all the moms say, oh, I have a 3-month-old now, here's all my newborn stuff. And then, oh, here's my car seat, it hasn't expired yet, it's still really good, I got a different one, or I got 2, here, have this. And more often than not, there is no financial cost to anyone involved in these groups. It's a really popular trend. And I like to think the future will be more like that, where people have resources we don't want to waste, we don't want to throw things out, we don't want to make things we don't need. So people in the community are sort of sharing the things that they need, like these mom groups who share essential, expensive baby items to make sure they are used to the fullest extent of their lives, saving everyone money, and also creating that sense of, you feel really good. I mean, even our nieces, I know, were part of an exchange with some of their friends. There's a big friend group, and they share clothing because the kids grow again so fast. And it was a lot of fun because, oh, you wore this unicorn sweater and I love it. Now I get to wear the unicorn sweater, and you talk about all your memories wearing the unicorn sweater. That's super fun, And it's just sort of, it brings more meaning to everything that you communally own, because it is so much more than just a thing that you have.
Yeah, that's very true. And so we argue that new communities ought to be, a couple hundred to a couple thousand people to maintain those values that Abby talked about, and also that most goods would be more public than privately owned. Now, we take a moment here to nod that what we're saying there is a very communist idea. And communism has a history of issues with it.
Yeah.
And so that always reminds me of an analogy of my own. I didn't know how to do that sentence. Yeah. I mixed up the order. But sometimes when I'm talking to other people about this theory, there will be the counter argument, well, communism didn't work, so why would the new communities that have some communist traits succeed? Because on paper, communism is great, and in practice, it has never really worked. But my rebuttal to that is, you might have a very good recipe for an apple pie that does work, but the chef is incompetent. So if the apple pie doesn't come out right, it doesn't mean it's the recipe's fault necessarily. Or again, if you want to get to the top of a staircase and you're at the bottom and you try and leap to the very top from the very bottom, you're going to fall halfway up and crash and then roll back down painfully.
And say, stairs don't work. What's the point of them?
And then if you say, well, stairs aren't efficient, I'm only going to use hills from now on, you limit yourself. And so in the same way, our argument is, although this part of the Acts does incorporate some things from communism, we feel they're more of a logical conclusion that we've drawn based on the progression of the mitigation of damage and the wings of love and strengthening those pillars at play that we talked about in chapter 3. For those reasons, we encourage the reduction of private goods. And so we don't have to be afraid of that.
There's so many cultures and traditions and policies and ways of life around the world, and they all have stigmas attached to them. And we pull from everything. We do not discriminate. We will look at every philosophy, every way of living that people will present to us, and we'll say, okay, objectively, what makes sense? Because, like I said, with the mom trade thing, that makes so much sense. That is communistic in a sense, but at the same time, in practice, it's a beautiful thing. It's such a wonderful thing, and you shouldn't let the 1% of an ideology that is beautiful and good and usable be tainted by the 99% of what we're not using that has been used to cause harm other places. You shouldn't shun something entirely just because one part of it is bad. It's sort of like, as we said, we're not particularly religious, but we have studied many religions to try to have an understanding of humanity and different philosophies and ways of thinking, and to also be respectful to other humans. And there are a lot of extremists in a lot of religions. It would be very narrow-minded to write off an entire religion only on the basis of one extremist that you hear of who happened to participate in that religion. They might not have known about the religion, they may not have participated fully, they might be part of an extremist sect of that religion, but you can't denounce an entire people because of a small population of extreme views. So we too have looked at all things in the world. We have looked at all different...
We have looked at all things in the world.
There's
There's nothing else to look at.
Well, we've looked at all of the different ideologies and whatnot, and we have determined that communism was essentially created to be a way to help people. So we do have, and we will acknowledge, there are some aspects of communism within our ideology, and that in itself sounds scary. But again, you don't throw away the whole idea just because it's misused and abused. You don't do that. So we take the 1% that we think is applicable and good and merge it with all of the other philosophies. And we hope that you look at what we're saying as the beautiful merging of many philosophies. And in practice, would that be a good thing? If it was able to work, would it be a good thing?
That's right. You might not want to eat a raw onion, but if you put it in a stew with other delicious ingredients, suddenly that onion enhances the flavor and is the most delicious part.
Ooh, or caramelize an onion?
And now she's hungry. But anyway, so that's sort of our utopic ideal, smaller communities. And the cherry on top of this sundae of the new community, of course, incorporating all the ideas that have already been laid out in Act 1, 2, 3,
4.
Right. Thank you, Abby. Author, right? She knows what's up.
I'm making fun of you, but thank you.
That's fair. So all the different programs that we argue for in those acts, we assume would apply in the new communities. But because the new communities are so far in the future in our philosophy, we concede that leadership, as decades progress towards that, if they do, would maybe have a different vision, be much wiser than us. And we're okay with that. But this is just, it's always good to generally know what target you're shooting at. And then, you can always make adjustments down the road. But in terms of technology, because all of this, really, the discussion of damage starts with the theory that unmoderated technology has really opened the door to damage. Damage has always probably existed in humanity, but it became...
Exacerbated.
That's very well said, Abby. Exacerbated. Like, if you're out in the cold, it can be bad, but if you then pour a bucket of water on that person, well, then they can die very quickly from hypothermia. So it's become exacerbated. And so we would foresee that the new communities would have a great reduction in technology, have moderated technology, and perhaps even have a system of what we call in the book provider stations, which would perhaps be sort of between the new communities or shared amongst new communities, stations that maintained a higher degree of technological capability to produce some of the technology that we wouldn't want to see go by the wayside. Speaking of baby with the bathwater, technologies like
medicine, inoculations to prevent super preventable diseases. You know, what else?
Yeah, so antibiotics, because obviously we don't want people just dying in childbirth because of infection. Contraceptives would be something that would be positive. Certainly assists with reproductive rights. Things like fluoride, greatly beneficial for the old tooths. And other, very important quality of life things that could be held on to without damaging the wings of love. So the new communities would be, we foresee, quite rustic, but with access to really important quality of life technologies, from provider stations, as we discuss. So that, I think, Abby, is sort of like a ship far out to sea. And sometimes there's mist that hovers over the water, and it can be difficult to make out the shape of the ship. You don't exactly know. But as we talk about, as long as these steps are followed, we think society will get a much clearer idea of what that end state would look like. We suggest the new communities and that sort of idea, but could very well change, and that ship could turn out to be a
hill filled with goats.
Indeed.
It's an island.
It's an island. It's a goat hill.
I just think that's kind of cute. A little island and all these goats are hopping around, just having fun.
Yes. That's why we don't spend too much time on vivid descriptions of the new community, simply because it would be sort of absurd for Abby and I to sit here and postulate about them.
We aren't psychics. We don't know the future, and we just feel like it's important to have some kind of a rough sketch to see the goal we are trying to accomplish. And then how to get there, we can redraw that. We can make it using acrylics, and we can paint it and use all these fancy art techniques. But the rough sketch, the main essence of what we're trying to say, it's important to have one of those before you can go anywhere. If you go into the woods and you don't know you're supposed to be going north, you might not know how you're getting north. You might not know what is north. But if you don't know that's the direction you're supposed to go, you're going to get really, really lost.
Very true. Or to steal an example from our own stories, the social blueprint. You'll recall when we were talking about damage and how it is manufactured, the architect, the builder, and the interior designer. Well, the architect may put a blueprint together, and maybe we'll see some of the foundations being constructed, but they can never imagine how that castle is going to look when it's done, and what the people will be doing there, and what the gardens will look like. So we've given lots of examples of why we're not giving too much more detail, but it is sort of a fun thought experiment. And if you have ideas about how a new community, a utopic, moderated technology community would look, share in the comments. There are, of course, issues that spring out with these sort of ideas. You could say to Ian and Abby, well, how does leadership work? How does defense of a nation work? How do all these things work? But again, it is important to remember that at this stage in society, if things have gone that well for long enough, damage will be quite reduced, and the dangers of colonialism and all these things that have happened in the past will be hopefully much less risky affair. And we also foresee that occasionally, if in a couple hundred years people do achieve new communities, technology will rise again. The Ferris wheel will reach the top of the cycle again. And that is just the way that we predict humanity is going to proceed. If they're able to reduce damage once, it may only be for a short time, and then damage will flare up again and reduce itself again. But the example we give in the book about that is a farmer plowing a field, and he has a talking ox. because Abby loves talking animals. And I think she would like oxes. Oxes, if they could speak, I think would be pretty relaxed, sort of zen,
He's going to take me to a petting zoo now.
furry, and very cute. Big eyes that kind of blink at you.
It just sounds like our dogs.
Yeah, basically. So anyway, the story about that, because you're saying to me and Abby, you're saying, well, Ian and Abby, that utopic society would eventually fail for X, Y, Z reasons. We tend to agree that it probably would at some point. But it's like a farmer, and the farmer and his ox get a new field. Mm-hmm. And so the farmer and the ox were plowing the field for the first time. They just got to a plot of land, and the farmer harnesses up the plow to the ox, and they're digging the furrows for the first time, and the ground is hard, and there's roots and there's rocks, and the ox is exhausted by the end, lathered in sweat. The farmer's exhausted, but they've tilled the first.
Do oxen sweat?
Yeah, they get lathered, sweaty. Yeah, I think so. And so the farmer says to the ox, well, we're done this year, and maybe next year we'll do it again. And the ox says, I can't do this every year. That's too much work. And the farmer laughs and says, don't worry, friend ox. It'll get easier each time because the ground is going to become softer each year and more pliable. And the hard work was done the first time, the breaking of the ground. So we sort of see the social blueprint the first time, if the steps are followed, like that first tilling of the soil. But if humanity trips and falls again, which we assume it will, each time going back to the steps of the social blueprint, if indeed that's what is followed, will become easier. Or another example might be if you walk a path in the woods for a first time.
There's a lot of brambles and roots and weird things and things scurrying just out of your sight line. And you're like, was it a bear, a moose, a bunny?
An ox.
An ox.
And it can be hard to follow.
Yeah.
You might lose your way the first time. But what if you walk that path 50 times?
Then you start to get a divot in the ground. You can sort of see where you're going before you go there.
Yes. It just becomes an easier path to follow. So I think we'll leave it there. We have one more chapter to talk about, which is sort of an administrative chapter. It's about the rules of discussion, because as Abby and I move forward with you through the years, we want your engagement. We want your questions. Abby is a teacher by nature, and I am trying to be a philosopher, and we would love to discuss questions you have. And we see that in modern society, it's hard to have a good, valuable discussion because the rules of discussion are so often ignored. You know, cutting people off, ad hominem attacks, things like that. So we'll talk about that next episode, about the best way to ask questions to have a respectful and valuable interaction. And also something for our political leaders to hopefully learn from. Eh, Abby?
If I have to watch another debate, I might cry. I just can't. And no one's happy with how they go. I don't think I've met one person who thought it was great that it was just a bunch of people yelling at each other for an hour. So it would be nice if people could just actually answer questions and have plans that they share with the public, as opposed to just saying what the other person is doing wrong, because that gets old 20 years ago. I'm over it.
Yikes. But thank you for sticking with us so far. Thanks for tuning in. We have achieved the banishment of damage by moderating technology and by reinforcing love and giving the angel of love powerful weaponry so that guilt and hate, those subconscious tricksters, are put back in their place, back into Pandora's box, where they hopefully won't trouble us for some time. So, hope to see you next time.
Have a great day.